This is the combined Module 7 and 8 lecture on methods of ethnographic analysis and reading and writing ethnographies. Before I start, I just want to apologize in advance. There's a lot of construction work going on in my building, and there might be some jackhammering at some point during this lecture. I'll try to pause it and pick up again if that happens. Have you ever heard the story of the 6 blind men who felt an elephant and tried to explain what it was? I'll read one version of the story to you. It goes, a long time ago, in the valley of Brahmaputra in India, there lived 6 men who were much inclined to boast of their wit and lore. One day they fell to arguing over the elephant. Now, since each was blind, none had ever seen that mighty beast of whom so many tales were told. So, to satisfy their minds and settle the dispute, they decided to go and seek out an elephant. Having hired a young guide, they set out early one morning in single file along the forest track, each placing his hands on the back of the man in front. It was not long before they came to a forest clearing where a huge bull elephant, quite tame, was standing contemplating his menu for the day. The 6 blind men became quite excited. At last they would satisfy their minds. Thus it was that the men took turns to investigate the elephant's shape and form. As all 6 men were blind, neither of them could see the whole elephant and approached the elephant from different directions. After encountering the elephant, each man proclaimed in turn, "Oh, my brothers," the first man at once cried out, "it is as sure as I am wise that this elephant is like a great mud wall, baked hard in the sun." "Now, my brothers," the second man exclaimed with a cry of dawning recognition, "I can tell you what shape this elephant is. He is exactly like a spear." The others smiled in disbelief. "Why, dear brothers, do you not see?" said the third man. "This elephant is very much like a rope," he shouted. "Ha! I thought as much," the fourth man declared excitedly. "This elephant much resembles a serpent." The others snorted their contempt. "Good gracious, brothers," the fifth man called out. "Even a blind man can see what shape the elephant resembles most. Why, he's mightily like a fan." At last it was the turn of the 6th old fellow, and he proclaimed, "This sturdy pillar, brother's mind feels exactly like the trunk of a great areca palm tree." Of course, no one believed him. Their curiosity satisfied, they all linked hands and followed the guide back to the village. Once there, seated beneath a waving palm, the 6 blind men began disputing loud and long. Each now had his own opinion, firmly based on his own experience of what an elephant is really like. For after all, each had felt the elephant for himself and knew that he was right. And so indeed he was. For depending on how the elephant is seen, each blind man was partly right, though all were in the wrong. I told this story here because it's a little bit like the task that you're going to face in making sense of your ethnographic data. You will assemble observations and quotations from a variety of sources, each offering some insight into the overall cultural picture that you are trying to develop. What you need to do after that is to somehow develop a way of bringing them all together and making sense of them, which might be a difficult task, like getting the 6 blind men to agree on what an elephant is like. Furthermore, a different observer looking at the same set of ethnographic data or the same circumstances might come away with very different observations. Again, the lesson of the 6 blind men is relevant here. So the practice of writing ethnography, of analyzing ethnography, and even of reading ethnography are all really interactions between an individual ethnographer and the situations that they are observing and the people that they might be talking to. But by now you should be well equipped to carry out an ethnographic investigation of your own. As you emerge from the data collection phase of your investigation, you'll have an array of data, whether in the form of transcripts, maybe observation notes, or maybe even photographs and recordings. At this stage, your task is going to be to interpret this raw data in order to draw some conclusions about the cultural context and the topic that you are investigating. As Judith Bell notes, raw data taken from questionnaires, interview schedules, checklists, etc. needs to be recorded, analyzed, and interpreted. 100 separate pieces of interesting information will mean nothing to a researcher or to a reader unless they've been categorized and interpreted. We are constantly looking for similarities and differences, for groupings, patterns, and items of particular significance. This might seem like a daunting task to the first-time researcher, but fortunately there are a number of practical activities based around the data you have collected that will help you to begin the process of identifying what you have found out during your research. Data analysis refers to the process of organizing your data in a format that you can work with, and then making connections between bits of data in order to see how it all comes together in a bigger picture. Analysis of qualitative data aims to uncover meaning from the data, whether it be field notes from your observations, words your participants might have used in an interview, videos, or images even. This is a process of interpretation, and as such, it will be greatly influenced by the ethnographer's own perspectives and interests. Those interpretations must be based on the data, just like the 6 blind men's interpretations of what an elephant was like were certainly based on what they had actually encountered when they felt the elephant. But the way that the data are organized, the themes that are chosen to explain the data, and the way that those themes are explained will be subjective, depending, like with the blind men, on which angle of approach you take. These are subjective judgments of the researcher. The researcher's task is to capture the intended meanings, working them into an interpretive framework that makes sense without distorting or overlooking important points in the data. In your reading, you might encounter different approaches to qualitative data analysis or ethnographic data analysis, which all represent systematic ways of reading the data in order to establish categories and draw connections between categories. The first step of data analysis should be to read or listen to, if you have audio recordings, and reread or re-listen to the data in order to make yourself as familiar as possible with what has been said. I usually say that once I get through with all of the reading of my interview transcripts that I need to do for a particular study, somebody should be able to tell me more or less any situation from any of my interviewees, and I would be able to immediately recall who it was that they're talking about and what the context was for that situation. Jennifer Mason, in the article that I've given on your additional reading list, says that there are 3 ways of reading data. Literally, which means paying close attention to the words and language that are being used, exactly what is being said. Interpretively, in which you construct a version of what you think is meant, perhaps inferring from what is being said to what is not being stated explicitly. And then reflexively, in which you position yourself as part of the data, trying to make explicit your own role in the particular way that the data were generated and are being interpreted. For example, if you ask a particular type of questions, people might end up providing responses that they wouldn't have thought of without the specific prompt that came about from your interest in the particular topic in your questioning. That doesn't mean that it's untrue. It might just simply be that it was created through the dialogue between you and that particular person. As a qualitative researcher, you should attempt to read your data at all 3 of these levels, as each will provide a different focus, allowing you to integrate the participants' own words and meanings with your theoretical perspectives into a coherent overall account. As you read the data or listen to the data over and over again, you'll be looking for themes or categories which will help you to explain what is being said and to draw connections between different parts of your data. One way to identify themes is to look for topics that come up repeatedly. Looking for similarities and differences between things that people say, or for mention of topics that you had identified yourself before beginning the project, can also generate categories. As you identify categories, you should develop some system for marking the sections of your data that relate to certain categories, so that you can draw them all together to make comparisons and draw conclusions about them. The article Techniques to Identify Themes that I've included on your reading list is really helpful to give you a number of different strategies that you might want to think about for coming up with these themes or categories that will help you to make your analysis more rigorous. Analytical themes can be identified on the basis of a priori interest, meaning things that you were interested in going into the research. So if your research aim was to understand, for example, the circumstances in which people chose to attend a smoking cessation program, then each time an interviewee states a reason for attending, this might be coded as a new theme. Themes can also emerge from more complex ways of looking at a text, like an interview transcript. So Ryan and Bernard in the article Techniques to Identify Themes that I just mentioned provide an extremely clear and useful guide to various techniques for identifying themes. And then coding is done essentially by highlighting sections of data and assigning labels that associate that section with one or more identified themes. This is going to give you a kind of cataloging system that will make it easier to pull up parts of your data that are relevant to a particular theme when you get ready to write about that area from your research. Some qualitative researchers distinguish between open, axial, and selective coding, so I'll explain what those mean. Open coding is undertaken when you first read each transcript on an individual basis, simply looking for themes and categories, but also digging deep enough into each transcript to assess, for example, whether there are important things that are not being said, and maybe if you can get a sense from the interview about why certain things might not be being said, or whether the way that things are said is indicative of further themes. Axial coding is a further step which involves organizing categories, grouping codes, and reading across several transcripts rather than individually. So we're starting to draw connections between people and draw connections between themes or categories. And selective coding is performed during a third read through the transcripts, and this involves scanning data and existing codes, looking for cases that might illustrate particular themes that you will want to discuss, and making comparisons and contrasts between those people that were being interviewed. You don't need to worry too much about this differentiation or following those 3 steps exactly, but it's kind of useful to think about the fact that there might be multiple steps or different levels of depth in your engagement with looking for themes in your data. The mechanical aspects of coding, i.e. marking up sections of data with coding labels. So if we identify a theme as attending a smoking cessation clinic, maybe every time that theme is referred to, we're going to color that in yellow if we have data in the form of a text. If we have audio or video recordings, we might use timestamps and make a note in a document or in a notebook somewhere what themes are covered at different timestamps. This can be undertaken manually, highlighting passages with different colors, or literally cutting and pasting with scissors and glue sections onto some kind of indexing system. The old-fashioned way was to use index cards. You could also use the comments function in a word processor, and there are a number of specialized qualitative analysis software packages also available. Now, the point of any research or any investigation, including ethnographic investigations, is to learn something about the world around us, and then to tell others what we've learned. The raw data, i.e. the information obtained before you begin to edit and analyze it, these are often virtually meaningless in and of themselves, and there may be more than one plausible way to interpret the data that you've obtained. It's the job of the researcher, or the ethnographer, to persuade the readers that his or her interpretation is plausible and is in some way better than the alternative interpretations. This is done by constructing arguments, critically and based on sound analysis of the data, to show that your data answer your research question in a particular way, and then writing up your research to share with others. And this is the reason why the Jennifer Mason chapter that I've included on your additional reading list is entitled Making Arguments from Qualitative Data. So by now you might be wondering, what do you actually need to include when you try to write up your ethnographic investigation? What goes into an ethnographic write-up? And partly this is the reason why I'm trying to give you a lot of examples in your assigned reading, because the more ethnography you read, the more of a feel you'll have for the kinds of details and quotations and the ways that ethnographers make their arguments, the kinds of arguments that are included in an ethnography. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specific types of details that are often used in ethnographic write-ups and how these are made use of. Consider this paragraph from the first page of the Fetterman chapter that I asked you to read. Ethnographic writing is as difficult and as satisfying as descriptions of nature. From simple notes about small events, special landmarks, or even the temperature, to efforts to describe an experience or explain a sudden insight, ethnographic writing requires an eye for detail, an ability to express that detail in its proper context, and the language skills to weave small details and bits of meaning into a textured fabric. The ethnographer must recreate the varied forms of social organization and interaction that months of observation and study have revealed. Note that you're not going to be undertaking months of observation and study for your own investigation here. The manifold symbolism every culture displays and the adaptiveness of people to their environment must somehow come to life on the page. In other words, somehow you need to use descriptions in a way that will enable the reader to imagine and experience in their minds what you have experienced in reality through your interactions with the people who are the subject of the ethnography. So we need to consider how we choose which details to record, what details of possible significance we might have neglected to record or even to notice, what kind of picture of the culture emerges from our analysis and description, whose words or voice are being heard. Are there people in the culture that we're studying that we haven't encountered? And if so, why? Is it because of a power difference? Is it because we weren't aware enough about all of the different kinds of people in the society? Is it because we were simply focusing on one particular group of people? That's fine. Is our own voice dominant over the voice of the people that we're writing about? What might have been different if we had spoken to other members of the culture, or if someone other than us had been present for these experiences that we're describing? Good ethnographic writing thus starts with writing good field notes, or even beforehand, with thinking about how and what you will observe and record during your investigation. Fetterman spends a fair bit of time talking about writing field notes, and then he talks about memoranda, in which you will begin to synthesize, reflect on, and develop your analysis or conclusions about what is going on. You might think of these memoranda as comparable to what you are doing when you post in discussion forums and write up your reflective journals. And you can then draw on them in writing your final reports and presentations. Now, these are not steps that you have to go through necessarily in a particular order, but it's a good recommendation to encourage you to really be thinking deeply at all the different levels of thinking that need to be going on when you're doing ethnographic investigation. And it's not a bad idea to keep a journal of your observations and what you're thinking about your observations. And that can be your memoranda. That can also go in as your final reflective journal for the assignment. Now, starting on page 125, Fetterman talks about some of the key ways that data is presented in ethnographic writing, which are thick description and verbatim quotations. The term thick description refers to descriptions of a behavior or event that describe not only what happened or what was observed, but also seek to explain the social and cultural context behind the event. What makes it meaningful? For example, go back and have a look at the posts that I asked you to write in the very first week of class in the discussion forum, in which you and others described an everyday cultural practice as if from an outsider's perspective. Some of the descriptions that came out simply described what happened, and that's fine, that's exactly what I asked you to do. For example, people dress in a particular way. But others of you went on to explain what people were trying to achieve by dressing in this way, how it fits into the overall culture, and what the mode of dress means to them. These meanings can be elicited, clarified, and presented in the words of members of the culture by choosing quotations to present word for word. However, it is still the responsibility of the ethnographer to contextualize and explain any verbatim quotations that are being used. So we might think that by using the exact words of one of our participants, we're ensuring that it's their voice which is being heard. And of course, yes, to some extent it is. It was their voice that was used to say those words. But it's in our selection of the words and not all of the words that were said, because we couldn't simply plonk down transcripts from X number of interviews and call that an ethnography. It's in that selection of details and selection of quotations and words in which the ethnographer's voice may become implicitly or sometimes even explicitly present. Ethnography has been called the most personal of the social sciences, meaning that unlike in statistical research, the main instruments for documenting and presenting cultural information in ethnography are actually the ethnographers themselves. And yet, the purpose of ethnography, at least for this class assignment, is to learn something about another person, another group of people or culture, and their perspectives. Because we're the ones asking the questions and making observations and writing up the findings, we're in a really privileged position. We're speaking on behalf of someone else. How can we do this in a way that remains true to the emic position? Go back and look up in earlier sessions what we mean by the emic position, if you can't remember. That we are trying to understand and represent. How will we and our readers know whether or not we have presented somebody else's views in a way that they would recognize as their own? One strategy that can help is to repeatedly check your interpretations as an ethnographer with members of the culture that you're studying. You might say something like, from what I understand that others have told me, it seems that blah, blah, blah. Would you agree? It may be worth asking the same question of several people, because individuals within a culture might have different views and voices also. And Fetterman also emphasizes the importance of being honest about the ethnographer's presence and role in presenting a culture. Acting as if there were no subjective interpretation doesn't make the ethnographic discussion more objective, it just hides the subjectivity and even bias that are inevitably present in social research. As Fetterman says on page 128, the ethnographic presence tells the reader how close the ethnographer is to the people and to the data and their role in the story. In ethnography, the voice of the ethnographer is always present. We don't say it is thought, it is done, but I think, I saw, I heard. Other authors emphasize the presence of the ethnographer by referring to data generation rather than data collection. That is, any observations or quotations that might be generated have come about only through the interaction of the investigator and the study community. By acknowledging and describing how the ethnographic data were generated, the ethnographer lets the reader see transparently how you arrived at their observations and conclusions. I'm going to return to another example from our discussion forum, and I've actually pasted the quote from the discussion forum here on the slide, not to put anybody on the spot, but I think this was a really, really interesting and useful example that generated some interesting discussion. One student posted a description of an incident in Honduras in which a boy suffering from an epileptic seizure had Bibles and shoes thrown at him because the villagers believed he was possessed by a demon. This evoked a lot of emotions among the class, which is hardly surprising, given how challenging the image of an unwell child being assaulted by his own visitors is to our cultural sensibilities. Of course, there are other reasons why this might be challenging to us, but we're focusing on culture for the time being. Now let's see if we can peel back the different layers of meaning and interpretation, kind of like an onion, and identify all the voices and presences in this account. So first, of course, there's the boy. We know that he had a seizure episode because Darcy witnessed it for us. We don't know much more about him or how he felt about his experience. If Darcy hadn't been there, this incident would almost certainly not have come to our attention. And then there are the other villagers who threw Bibles and shoes at the boy. Again, we know that this happened because Darcy witnessed it. They almost certainly will have had other interactions at various times with this boy, but we don't know anything about those other interactions because our observer wasn't there to see them, or perhaps didn't choose to tell us about them. We don't know whether throwing things was typical of the villagers' interactions with the boy, or if they normally treated him kindly, but they were so shocked by this event that they responded in an unusual manner. We don't know if they treated other individuals in the same way or not. We just have this particular interaction that was observed, and it's at once troubling and interesting to the outsiders present. Now we need to think about the meaning behind this action. And the observer here, Darcy's used thick description in order to tell us not only that the villagers threw shoes and Bibles, but that they did so because, why? Because they believed the boy to be possessed. One could go into more detail about the religious beliefs of these villagers, maybe their education, their ethno-medical system, and so on, so that we could understand more fully the significance of demonic possession in this cultural context. An ethnographer might spend time talking to the people who took part in the incident to understand why they did what they did. Were they trying to punish him? Cure him? Drive out the demon? Did they feel that it worked? The ethnographer might also talk to the boy to find out whether he shared their belief that he was possessed, and what it meant to him to have had objects thrown at him during his seizure. And now the next layer of the onion is the ethnographer or observer herself. There were many elements from her background, including perhaps most importantly the fact that she was engaging in the capacity as a missionary, that made this event memorable and noteworthy. How do you think this impacted on her interpretation and that of the group that she was with of the meaning of this event? A reaction of horror and of the mission team not being equipped to deal with this was described. These reactions of the missionaries are also part of the ethnographic description. Then finally we have the readers, all of us who read and responded, whether on our thoughts only or perhaps by contributing to the discussion forum, with our own reactions. We are viewing the events, cultural beliefs, and descriptions through our own cultural and personal lenses. Our response could also form a part of that ethnography. If we go on to write about what we learned and our reactions to it, as you're going to be doing when you do your book review, case study, essay, so think about your own presence as a reader of an ethnographic work in interpreting the answer to the essay question that I've asked you to write about. So when you write your book review essays, you need to think about all of these layers. The people who are being described, the ethnographer who's choosing details to narrate, and the reader, and how meaning is being created at each level or each layer. So try to understand what we know and how we know it. Which interactions? Are they interactions between members of a culture, or with the ethnographer, or interactions between the ethnographer and the reader? What interactions have produced, and perhaps between the reader and our wider cultural environment also, have produced the data that is being presented to us. This is part of active critical engagement, which is a crucial skill in any circumstance in which we need to understand another culture or viewpoint. So at the end of the course, we're going to look in some detail at cultural competencies and ways of understanding and working with culture in public health practice. And this kind of critical thinking, critical engagement with another culture and with descriptions of another culture, it's not just an abstract exercise that I'm asking you to do for this assignment. It's going to come into bear in those cultural competencies also. So that's the end of the lecture for modules 7 and 8. Please get in touch with me if you are still worried about any aspect of that assignment coming up.